It's the dead of night. Our protagonist, Shiva, lights a smoke and, in the eerie silence, raises his lantern. And then, suddenly, yeah, that keeps happening multiple times. If you've seen the movie Kantara, and like me, are drawn to the mystery of the movie, do keep watching. And if you haven't seen the movie, stop this video right now. And if you weren't fortunate enough to catch it in the theater, I believe it's currently running on Amazon Prime. Now, Paul is ahead. Today, we'll be peeling back the many layers, take a deep dive into the mystery and symbolism of the movie, and hopefully answer the central question: did our protagonist Shiva really disappear into the forest? Namaskaram, listeners. Nishta Jeeva here, and today we'll be looking at the horror and wonder of Kantara. To answer this question, few things must be revisited for the sake of our analysis. Now, if you don't want to retread familiar ground, click on this timestamp to go straight to analysis. Now, onto the plot. I swear I'll try to make this brief. The story starts where a king, well endowed with riches and the love of his people, has still a void in his heart. A divine dissatisfaction, a seeking of inner peace propels him to the forest, where he finds a rock that is sanctified as Panjurli, the guardian deity / demigod of the forest. The correct word for Panjurli here is Daiva, not your god of the Deva tier, but still a divine entity, a force of nature that exists at a deeper level with respect to our reality. The king is drawn to the spiritual power of Panjurli. One of the shamanistic tribesmen takes the ovation of Panjurli, meaning he channels the divine consciousness to speak through him, and puts forth his terms to the king. Panjurli accepts to bestow the peace and happiness to his kingdom by making the forest spirit part of it. But in exchange for this, that much amount of land was to be given to the forest dwellers, the extent to which his shout travelled. He makes it clear that even if the king went back on his word, his compatriot, another Daiva called Guliga, would never forget, never forgive. Thus, the momentum of karma is spurred, and that karmic connection between ancestors and deities is woven throughout the plot. Flash forward to 1970, when at the bhootakola ritual, where Panjurli's avesham is annually invoked, the descendant of this king, now a zamindar, a landowner, asks of Panjurli, or rather, the performer channeling Panjurli, to hand over the land of the villagers to him, the supposed rightful owner and landlord. Even threatening to go to court over this, Panjurli denies. The zamindar even mocks the existence of Panjurli, whether his speech is really his or the performer's. In comes the response: if this is really the avesham of Panjurli, he would vanish without a sign in the forest. Also threatens repercussion if he dared to take the legal route. The performer seemingly disappears into the forest in a circle of fire. Note this point about the flame, I will touch on this later. We are then greeted to the zamindar, bleeding to death on the stairs of the court. This part of the movie establishes the fact that Panjurli is not some distant folklore, but a living force that exists in the age of the modern Indian state. Fast forward again to the year 1990, the year in which the primary plot takes place. It is established that the Kola performer that disappeared into the forest 20 years ago was the father of our protagonist, Shiva. He hasn't taken up his ancestral duty as a bhootakola performer because of that disappearance. He is shown as this Chad lout, acing the Kambala buffalo sport, beating up even our present-day zamindar Devendra's men as the fight erupts. He hunts wild animals, even boars, who, by the way, are the form Panjurli is depicted and idolized as. Basically, the opposite lifestyle path as a Kola performer should lead. It must be noted that he has no animosity toward the deity. He is simply afraid. But it seems that Panjurli has plans for him. His heart still beats for the people of his village and forest. He also seems to have a good relationship with the current descendant of the royal family, and the zamindar Devendra also seems to have the welfare of the villagers at heart. Refreshing. The plot suggests the primary conflict is between the forest official Murlidhar and the people. Murlidhar intends to reserve the forest with the Indian state and has a problem with the natives taking resources from the forest and their loud cultural practices, even once having a fight over firecrackers. More on this later. An important thread that erupts in the story is Shiva's encounters with Panjurli, who appears in the form of his father in the bhootakola attire. Scenes that seem straight out of a horror movie. These scenes suggest the Daivas' higher calling for Shiva, and as Shiva clashes with Murlidhar time and time again, with the backing and support from Devendra, it becomes an ugly tussle between the two as the plot goes on, which results in Shiva being sent to prison on charges of trying to kill the officer. In parallel, Devendra seems to be fighting a legal battle against the state, collecting signatures from the villagers regarding their land deeds. But it turns out there is an ulterior motive. Devendra divulges his diabolical plan to Guruva, Shiva's cousin and the current bhootakola performer, asks of him to speak as Panjurli, convincing the villagers to sell off their land to the zamindar, as if his stealing of their land is divinely ordained. Guruva mentions that it is not him but Panjurli's avesham that commands him, and he wouldn't be able to do this adharmic deed. Devendra kills him and dumps his body, all the while fake grieving about his death in public. Now, it is quite established that Shiva is privy to forces well beyond the immediate senses of a human being. And, while he sleeps, he has a creepy vision of a Guruva in his Panjurli attire, crying just outside his prison walls, only to be revealed to him by his family and friends the next day of his death. After knowing this, Shiva meets Devendra, who lies to him saying that this was Forest Officer Murli's handdoing, trying to turn Shiva against him since naturally Murli is an obstacle to his taking over all that forest land. But Shiva learns from his pot-smoking blacksmith friend Mahadeva, just not subtle aren't they, that it was indeed Devendra who was responsible for the death. Shiva beats up some of Devendra's rowdies to get to Devendra. On reaching his village, Murli reveals to the villagers Devendra's true intentions. His attempt to get the villagers' signatures earlier in the film was just a deceptive ploy to hand over their land. He promises to ruin his ploy by reserving the forest land under the state with a provision for the local villagers to still dwell on it. This was Murlidhar's promise. Shiva also reveals to everyone the truth about Guruva's murder, and he, Murli, and the rest of the villagers make a final battle for their land against Devendra. Devendra, now finally unmasked, unleashes his henchmen on all who oppose him. Shiva is almost killed by one of these henchmen, who throws his head onto, as fate would have it, a stone of Panjurli Deva. Now, flashback to the origin story where Panjurli says that even if he forgives or forgets, his renegade compatriot Guliga would never. After facing this near-death scenario, Guliga enters Shiva's body, his avesham fully realized, and it is now Guliga, eccentrically jostling about, exhibiting divine, animalistic rage, executing dharma by killing Devendra's men and ultimately Devendra, the present iteration of the king who had gone back on his word. And in a now historic cinematic moment, the audience are stunned into silence. Years later, we see Shiva taking up his hereditary duty, adorning the makeup at the Bhootakola festival for the Daiva Aradhane, ready to ascend to become Panjurli's avesham. The now famous, or rather infamous, Varaharoopam song plays to the enchantment of the audience. In his dance, he joins his hands with Murli and the forest officials and the rest of the villagers in a symbolic gesture, and everyone will remember as the electric guitar solo kicks in, Shiva, with Panjurli in him, is drawn, just like his father, into the Kantara, the mystical forest. He trudges into it, greeted by the spirit of his father, also in the Bhootakola attire, and both seemingly disappear. Just like for most of the audiences, it was an overwhelming experience for me, and it took me quite a while to process the movie. Even the folks who ultimately label it as mid or overrated were taken aback by that ending. Now, two reactions come to mind when people watch that movie, especially that climax. A, they either recoil away, unable to rationalize their own response, or B, they spectate in stunned silence, reverence even. Now, why is that? I once read somewhere that the story is not a story about the divine as told by human beings, but a story about human beings as told by the divine. The whole story is the will of the deities, shaping the plot points, ultimately leading to that climax. The word Kantara itself means mysterious or enchanted deep forest, and its first utterance comes up in multiple sources, be it the Ramayana, Brihad Samhita, or even Buddhist texts like the Mahaprajna Paramita Shastra. And deep in this forest is rooted the Daiva named Panjurli, origins of which can be found in the Shiva Purana. Now, I believe that there are already other videos talking about this in detail, but I will mention the important point that he is a Gana of Lord Shiva. Gana you can imagine as an attendant or like a bodyguard. Now you know the reason why Lord Ganesha is called Ganapati. Point is, the story screams at you why our protagonist is called Shiva and why he has a special relationship with Panjurli. He even has a treehouse called Kailasha if it isn't obvious. Because of the disappearance of his father, which left his mother a widow, he was always scared of donning the role of the Daiva Nartaka. You might ask, what sort of a deity would turn their devotee into a widow? I came across this post that mentions, well, it is really something to be able to exit the world based on the will of the deity. And now the deity shapes and nudges Shiva throughout the plot to realize his destiny, his dharma. And Shiva all the while tries to escape his visions, drinks, fights, tries to be as unworthy of the role as possible. But interestingly, his fierce persona embodies the aspect of Guliga, the Kshetrapala, the guardian of the borders. Strangely, he seems to have a higher sense of awareness with the alcohol in the pot. No matter how worse his nightmares get, they're all heralding the inevitable. His doom or his ascendance. Kind of both. Shiva's karmic road to Panjurli is heralded by certain signs. The sound of the anklets, the appearance of the crown, and... Not sorry. Anyway, little by little, Shiva and the audience feel the return of the deity. And when Shiva's head is smashed into the Panjurli stone, the final step is crossed. His final fear is overcome when Guliga literally and figuratively cracks open his head to enter. The bali, that blood sacrifice, is a must for any Kshetrapala. Remember the point I made about the flame? Guliga, just like Panjurli in the Bhuta performances, takes the flame into the hand. There is this pattern when the Daivas manifest with the flame or disappear with it. Add to that rhythmic drum beats which are meant to build up energy so the avesham can sustain within you. Also, why there is immense hunger that the immediate thing that happens is being fed. There is this insightful video by Jaideep Bhide where he posits that the transformation is about Shiva's Kundalini awakening and describes how each of the chakras get opened up. I have linked it in the description. The Daivas once manifested not only destroy enemies of Dharma, but their pull is so strong and irresistible that even Forest Officer Murli is affected by it. He doesn't end up changing his mind, but there is an understanding that this power that is earthly, raw, terrifying, beautiful, and tied to the forces of nature cannot be controlled or contained by the modern Indian state. The existence of the Daivas is not projected as just a belief. There are no scientific explanations, no 50-50 ambivalence about, oh, this could be real, we don't really know. It doesn't even treat it as supernatural in the traditional sense. It doesn't play to any of that. It's just lived reality, just like all the practices within the dharmic fold. I've become especially infuriated with the way the plot introduces its twist. If you'd like to skip my rant, I urge you, click right here. Here's me presenting some genuine criticism as a fan of the movie. I thought its political themes are underdeveloped and not very well thought through. Yes, I'm talking about its theme of indigenous people versus the modern state. Now you might say, Nishta, now we know what the movie is really about, what the story is really about, and also, doesn't everything ultimately get resolved? Sorry, I wouldn't agree. See, the movie chose to project one of its central plot points as the villagers and their guardian deity against the forest officials. The scene where Murali is fed up by the villagers and their deity when he hears firecrackers was meant to invoke contemporary angst as the Indian state repeatedly impedes on primarily Hindu and indigenous customs owing to environmental or humanitarian concerns. And while the movie emphasized the importance of unbroken culture in the face of modernity and court systems, it never really resolved anything, but rather wished it away by introducing a common enemy, which is Devendra. What was essentially an interesting and an urgent issue about indigenous dharmic cultures versus the governments and states devolves into a one-dimensional evil zamindar take. I found it quite refreshing to see the movie introducing a non-evil landlord for once. But no, every single negative stereotype associated with the evil feudal lord, popularized by 80s, 90s movies, all comes in a combo package through the supposed twist of the story. Guys, can landlords not be totally evil for once? I'll suggest an alternate ending. Hear me out. So, Devendra is indeed tempted to sell the people's lands out of spite and greed, but has a change of heart when he sees the fate his people endure at the hands of the forest officials. He is nothing without the love of his people, and he wishes to get back the peace that was taken from his family when his father tried to go back on his word given to the Daivas. He clearly suffers in his present life as he is survived with a crippled son who wouldn't be able to lead a quality life or further his legacy. Call this the redemption arc. So, he attempts to give the land back to the villagers. He uses legal tricks to actually privatize the land and is able to use that authority to ultimately give that land back. And as Murali's bloodlust does indeed result in a violent showdown against Shiva and the villagers, Guliga, like before, does make the appearance, roaringly reminding everyone that as the modern humans fight the forest, its ecosystems, its people and customs have lived here in harmony long before the king and the nation-state created in 1947, forcing all stakeholders, Devendra included, to have a role in preserving the forest and its people. You might ask, Nishta, what's wrong with the way the movie ended? It's a reserved forest and everyone ultimately got to live in it, right? Everyone's happy? Yes, but that's not a long-term solution. The Indian Forest Act of 1927 classifies a reserve forest as where irrigation, farming, grazing, tilling, hunting, all are forbidden unless there is a settlement that is reached with the forest officer. As you can see, it's evident that how the forest officer turns out to be is quite critical. And more often than not, this settlement is incognizant of the old history, culture, and practices of the people and the land. Ask yourself this: who do you think has a greater will or skin in the game to preserve not just the ecological but also the cultural heritage of the land? On one end, you have custodians who have been part of this for God knows how long and lived in harmony with it, or a recently created political entity with this secular, nebulous notion of preserving our forests. Now, I will admit that the latter is more well-equipped in terms of plain resources, but it is by design adversarial unless circumstances dictate otherwise. And I also feel it's a more interesting premise to base the story on, but hey, that's just me. And I can see why the filmmakers did not go the risky, almost seditious route of making the state the ultimate villain. I can admire their narrative that the presence of the Daivas instill a need for coexistence and a mutual respect. I can respect that wishful thinking as Shiva, now channeling Panjurli, makes the symbolic joining of everyone's hands blissfully satisfied. But there's more to be done. There's another that needs joining. He looks onto that mysterious forest again. What he searched for and couldn't find since childhood beckons him again. Being the medium of the forest guardian isn't enough. He yearns to find the heart of the forest, and what he finds is that certain someone, and he could only be found because he's now prepared to take that final step. As the flame ensues one last time, they realize their final abode by becoming and being one with the ever-present, the forest. Both reunite in Panjurli, in the spirit of the forest. Fate's cycle spurs again, and we see that both disappear into that circle of fire. So, I hope that answers the central question. Shiva might have reached his final destination, but I believe that's not the end of Panjurli, who had decided to come onto our screens in the year 2022, reminding us that there is work to be done toward our forests, toward our traditions, and also how we may organize ourselves legally as a community. Our dharma awaits us. Thank you for watching. If you like this content, I would like to take this opportunity to request to check out the rest of my channel. I currently host a podcast show called Karan Ki Khaufnaak Kahaniyan, where I do horror story narrations and also write some of my own stories. I am helped by some very talented folks to make the production come alive. Available in Hindi and English. See you next time.